The North Sea has long been a graveyard for the ambitious, a grey and unforgiving expanse where the biting wind whispers the names of the drowned. But on a sullen afternoon in July 1796, it was poised to become the burial ground of a single, lonely British ship. What the French lookouts saw emerging from the mist that day defied every established logic of naval warfare. For the vessel before them, hopelessly outgunned and surrounded, was not fleeing for its life. It was hunting. Before we commit this act of calculated madness to the history books, I invite you to join our ranks. If you value the forgotten truths of our past and the men who held the line when all hope was extinguished, do consider subscribing to the channel. Now, let us turn our eyes to the horizon, where the impossible is about to unfold. To understand the sheer weight of the silence that hung over the water that afternoon, one must first appreciate the geography of the disaster. We are off the coast of Flanders, near Hellevoetsluis. The water here is treacherous, shallow and grey, reflecting a sky that promises nothing but rain and misery. Cutting through the chop is His Majesty's ship Glatten. To the untrained eye, she is a curious beast. She lacks the sleek, predatory lines of a purpose-built frigate, nor does she possess the towering, castle-like majesty of a ship of the line. She is bulbous, wide in the beam, and sits somewhat heavy in the water. There is a reason for this ungainly silhouette. The Glatten was never born for war. She was built for trade, an East Indiaman designed to haul tea and spices, not to stand in the line of battle. She is a merchant in a wolf's coat, a converted experiment that many at the Admiralty viewed with sceptical derision. And she is alone. On the quarterdeck stands Captain Henry Trollope. He is 40 years of age, a man of the Royal Navy to his marrow, possessing that peculiar British temperament that regards overwhelming odds not as a terrifying prospect, but as a professional inconvenience. He raises his telescope, the brass cold against his eye, and scans the southern horizon. There, emerging like phantoms from the haze, are the shapes that every merchant captain dreads. They are sharp, fast, and lethal. It is a French squadron, prowling the shipping lanes, looking for easy prey to strangle the commerce of the island kingdom. Trollope counts them, his lips likely tightening in a grim line. There is a large frigate, the Brutus, leading the van. Behind her, another heavy frigate, the Incorruptible, followed by the Magician, the Republicain, and 2 smaller corvettes. The mathematics of the situation are terrifyingly simple. The French squadron possesses a combined weight of metal that could pulverize a stone fortress, let alone a wooden ship. They have nearly 200 cannons between them. They have crews numbering in the thousands, men flushed with the revolutionary zeal of the Republic, eager to humiliate the arrogant Royal Navy. They are faster than the Glatten. They are more maneuverable than the Glatten. By every handbook of naval tactics written since the days of Drake, there is only one course of action for Captain Trollope: run. He must pile on every inch of canvas, throw the water casks overboard to lighten the load, and pray for the cover of night. To engage a force 6 times your size is not bravery. It is suicide. It is a court-martial offence to throw away one of His Majesty's ships in a fit of vainglory. But Henry Trollope does not turn the wheel. The crew of the Glatten, rough men pressed from the docks of London and Portsmouth, look to their commander. They can see the enemy fleet growing larger, the white sails of the French billowing like storm clouds. They can hear the drumbeats calling the French crews to quarters across the water. The fear on the British deck is palpable, a cold knot in the stomach that every sailor knows, the anticipation of the splinter, the grape shot, and the surgeon's knife. They wait for the order to come about. They wait for the retreat. Instead, Trollope snaps the telescope shut with a definitive click. He turns to his sailing master, his voice calm, carrying that devastatingly flat tone of command that brooks no argument. "Clear for action," he says. "Steer for the Commodore." A ripple of disbelief must have surged through the officers. Steer for them? The captain intends to sail this lumbering, converted merchantman directly into the teeth of 6 warships. It is a decision that borders on insanity. Yet, discipline in the Georgian Navy is an iron band that holds men together when instinct screams for flight. The drums beat the rhythm of general quarters. The bulkheads are knocked down. The galley fire is extinguished. Sand is scattered on the decks to give the gun crews traction when the blood begins to flow. Across the water, on the quarterdeck of the Brutus, the French Commodore surely cannot believe his luck. He sees the British ship turning towards him and assumes, quite naturally, that she is confused or perhaps surrendering. After all, the Glatten looks fat and slow. She looks like a prize. The French officers likely smile, anticipating the prize money, the glory of capturing a British vessel without hardly firing a shot. They see a sheep walking willingly into the slaughterhouse. Little do they know, they are not looking at a sheep. They are looking at a Trojan horse, packed with a devastating secret that the Royal Navy has kept hidden for this precise moment. As the Glatten closes the distance, the wind singing in her rigging, the atmosphere shifts from fear to a strange, hypnotic focus. The gap narrows. 2 miles. 1 mile. The French ships form a line of battle, a wall of wood and iron. They are confident, perhaps too confident. They do not fire immediately. Why waste powder on a madman who is coming to you? They want to capture her intact. This hesitation, born of arrogance, is the first mistake in a tragedy that is about to unfold for the Republic. Trollope stands by the wheel, watching the enemy flagship grow until he can see the individual faces of the French Marines and the fighting tops. He can see the tricolour flag snapping in the breeze. He is waiting. He is waiting for a distance that would make a modern tactician weep. He does not want to fight at long range. His ship is not built for a duel of finesse. He wants a brawl. He wants to be so close that he can smell the breath of his enemy. The silence is agonizing. The only sounds are the wash of the bow wave and the creaking of the spars. The men at the guns, stripped to the waist, handkerchiefs tied around their heads to protect their hearing, stand frozen like statues of salt. They hold the lanyards, their eyes fixed on the gun ports, waiting for the word. They know that once the first shot is fired, the world will dissolve into smoke and chaos. They know that in 5 minutes, many of them will be dead. But there is something else on that deck, a grim confidence. For the men of the Glatten know what the French do not. They know what lies behind their own gun ports. They are not manning the standard long-barreled 18-pounders that equip the frigates of the day. They are manning something else entirely. Something short, ugly, and obscenely destructive. The Glatten draws A-beam of the Brutus. The distance is less than 20 yards. It is an intimate distance, a conversational distance. The French Commodore, finally realizing that this British captain has no intention of striking his colours, raises his speaking trumpet to demand a surrender. He expects the British flag to come down, a surrender. He expects the British flag to come down. Instead, Henry Trollope looks up at the red ensign floating above his head. He looks at the 6 enemy ships surrounding him, their cannons run out, their fuses lit. He looks at his men, waiting in the terrible shadows of the gun deck. He takes a breath, the salt air filling his lungs one last time before the sulphur takes it. He does not offer a speech. He does not offer a surrender. He offers a nightmare. Fire. And in that split second, before the lanyards are pulled and the world ignites, the trap is sprung. The French have sailed into the embrace of a monster, and the waters of Flanders are about to boil. To fully grasp the magnitude of the violence about to be unleashed upon the dark waters of the North Sea, we must first withdraw our gaze from the gun ports of the Glatten and cast it across the brooding map of Europe. It is 1796, and to be an Englishman in this year is to live in a state of perpetual, gnawing anxiety. The comfortable certainties of the 18th century are crumbling into dust, swept away by a tide of revolutionary fervour that has burst the banks of France and is now drowning the continent. In London, the mood is one of suffocating gloom. The war against the French Republic, initially greeted with the patriotic certainty that a rabble of regicides could never stand against the disciplined armies of kings, has morphed into a nightmare. the first coalition, that grand alliance of Austria, Prussia, and Britain intended to strangle the revolution in its cradle, is fracturing. Prussia has made its peace. Spain, once an ally, is drifting into the orbit of Paris, soon to turn its formidable fleet against us. And in the sun-baked plains of Italy, a virtually unknown Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte is doing the impossible, tearing apart the Austrian armies with a speed and savagery that defies all military convention. Britain stands dangerously alone. The wooden walls of the Royal Navy are no longer just a source of national pride. They are the only thing standing between the rolling fields of Kent and the sharp edge of the guillotine. If the Channel is lost, England is lost. There is no second line of defence. The spectre of invasion is not a ghost story told to frighten children. It is a very real tactical plan sitting on the desks of the French Directory in Paris. But the threat in 1796 is not just the grand invasion. It is the slow, agonizing bleed of commerce. The French, realizing they cannot yet match the Royal Navy ship for ship in a fleet action, have turned to a strategy of ruthless efficiency, guerre de course, the war of the chase. They have unleashed swarms of heavy frigates and privateers into the Atlantic and the North Sea. These vessels are masterpieces of naval architecture, sleek, fast, and weatherly. They prey upon the merchant convoys that are the lifeblood of the British economy. They strike like wolves, tearing out the throat of a convoy before the escorts can react, and then vanish into the mist. The loss of trade is catastrophic. Insurance rates at Lloyd's of London are skyrocketing. The price of bread is rising, sparking riots in the streets. The City of London is trembling. The Admiralty, ensconced in their high-ceilinged rooms at Whitehall, is under immense pressure to stop the bleeding, but they face a conundrum of physics and finance. To catch a French frigate, one needs a British frigate. Yet, the French ships are often larger, possessing heavier scantlings and larger crews. A standard British 32-gun frigate engaging a French 40-gun heavy frigate is fighting an uphill battle. To build ships capable of matching the French behemoths takes years that Britain does not have. The oak forests are depleting. The shipyards are at capacity. The treasury is running dry. Lord Spencer, the First Lord of the Admiralty, and his Sea Lords are desperate men searching for a shortcut. They need a weapon that can alter the balance of power without requiring the construction of a new fleet. They need a force multiplier. They need a way to turn the hunter into the hunted. It is in this climate of desperation that a radical idea begins to take hold. It is a concept that offends the sensibilities of the traditionalists, the old salts who believe that naval warfare should be conducted with gentlemanly precision and long-barreled guns. The idea is brutal in its simplicity. What if one were to take a ship, not a warship, but a robust merchant hull, and strip it of its standard armaments? What if, instead of the precise long-range 18-pounders that are the standard currency of naval duels, one were to arm it exclusively with a weapon of devastating close-range power? The weapon in question is the carronade. Named after the Carron Iron Works in Scotland where it was forged, it is a squat, ugly piece of ordnance. It has a short barrel and requires a small crew. It lacks the range of a long gun. To use it, one must be practically touching the enemy, but within that short range, it throws a ball of iron so heavy that it does not merely punch a hole in a ship, it shatters the structure entirely. It is a smosher. The Admiralty looks at the ledger. They have hulls sturdy East Indiamen purchased from the commercial fleet to serve as convoy escorts. They have the guns, but do they have the nerve to send a slow, converted merchant ship armed only with short-range guns against a fast French frigate? Seems, to many, like a sentence of death. If the enemy stays at range, they can pick the British ship apart piece by piece, dismantling her rigging until she lies dead in the water, helpless as a tortoise on its back. The captain of such a vessel would need to be a man of singular aggression, a man willing to endure terrible punishment to close the distance. Thus, the experiment is authorized. It is a gamble of the highest order. The HMS Glatton is fitted out, her gun ports widened to accommodate the massive snouts of the carronades. She is sent to sea not as a patrol vessel, but as a trap. The Admiralty waits, breath held. If the experiment fails, if the Glatten is captured or sunk, it will be a humiliation that the beleaguered government can ill afford. It will prove that British ingenuity has reached its limit and that the French technique is superior. However, as Captain Trollope sails his experimental command out of the Nore and into the grey chop of the North Sea, he carries with him more than just a new type of gun. He carries the weight of a nation that is slowly realizing it is fighting for its very existence. The men on board, checking their flints and sanding the decks, are unwitting participants in a tactical revolution. They are the tip of the spear in a desperate counterattack against the French naval hegemony. Little do the French squadron commanders know, as they gaze greedily at the Glatton's fat hull through their spyglasses, that they are not just facing a ship. They are facing the cornered, dangerous ingenuity of a Britain with its back to the wall. They see a merchantman. They do not see the geopolitical chess move that has placed this piece on the board. They do not realize that the Admiralty has authorized the creation of a monster, specifically designed to shatter the confidence of the Republican Navy. The sun dips lower over the Flanders coast. The strategic map of Europe, with its falling kings and burning borders, fades into the background, replaced by the immediate, visceral reality of wooden planks and iron cannons. The gamble has been made. The dice have been made. The dice have been thrown, and as the Glatten breaks the line of the horizon, the time for theory is over. The Smasher is about to speak, and its voice will echo far beyond the cold waters of the North Sea, straight to the heart of the French Admiralty. To understand why a lone ship would sail into the jaws of a fleet, we must look past the wooden hull of the Glatten and into the iron soul of the man who commanded her. History, in its tendency to worship the stars, often forgets the stones upon which the empire was built. We remember Nelson for his brilliance, Cochrane for his daring, and Pellew for his grace. But Henry Trollope was cut from a different cloth entirely. He was not a man of poetry or dashing romance. He was a creature of the glorious, brutal reality of the Georgian Navy, a man who viewed war not as an art, but as a job of work to be done with absolute, terrifying efficiency. Born to a reverend in the quiet shires, there was little in his upbringing to suggest the violence that would define his life. But the sea has a way of finding its own, and by 1796, Trollope had spent decades being hammered into shape by the Atlantic. He was 40 years old, a dangerous age for a frigate captain. It is the age where youthful recklessness has hardened into cold professional competence. He was known in the service not for his connections at court, nor for the elegance of his dress uniform, but for a pugnacious, bulldog obstinacy that made him difficult to manage in peace, but invaluable in war. Trollope was a man of the old navy. He possessed a face weathered by salt and sun and a voice that could cut through the roar of a gale without the aid of a trumpet. He was the sort of captain who knew the name of every topman in his crew and the precise breaking strain of every rope in his rigging. To the Admiralty, he was reliable, if somewhat unglamorous. To his men, he was old hard horse, a commander who would drive them relentlessly, but who would never ask them to stand in a place where he would not stand himself. But beneath this exterior of the dutiful servant lay a burning frustration. Trollope had spent years fighting the French, and he had grown to loathe the standard rhythm of naval engagement. The naval warfare of the late 18th century could often be a surprisingly tentative affair. Ships would circle each other at long range, firing their 18-pounders, shredding sails, knocking down spars, and killing men in 2s and 3s. It was a mathematical erosion of the enemy, a dance of geometry and wind. Trollope despised it. He found it wasteful. He found it wasteful. He found it indecisive. He belonged to a school of thought that believed the only way to end a battle was to destroy the enemy's capacity to fight, instantly and catastrophically. He wanted a weapon that matched his temperament, short, sharp, and brutal. This is why, when the whispers began to circulate in the coffee-houses of Portsmouth about the Admiralty's new experiment, the conversion of slow East Indiamen into warships, most captains turned up their noses. To command such a vessel was seen as a career killer. These ships were sluggish. They drifted to leeward like haystacks. They could not chase, and they could not run. A dashing captain in a fast frigate could capture prizes and make his fortune. A captain in a converted merchantman was nothing more than a floating battery destined for convoy duty and obscurity. Trollope, however, saw something the dandies did not. He requested the Glatten. One can imagine the scene at the Admiralty when he accepted the commission. The Sea Lords, perhaps swirling their port, eyeing this stubborn officer with a mixture of pity and respect. "You understand, Captain, they might have warned, she will not sail like a witch. If you find yourself in trouble, you cannot flee." Trollope understood perfectly. In fact, that was the point. He did not intend to flee. He intended to turn the Glatton's weakness, her inability to run into her greatest strength. If he could not maneuver, he would simply have to be unbreakable. If he could not chase the French, he would have to make them regret coming to him. He personally oversaw the fitting out of the ship, and it was here that his gamble truly took shape. The standard armament for a ship of Glatton's size would have been a battery of 18-pounder-long guns. Respectable, reliable guns. Trollope ordered them removed. In their place, on the main deck, he mounted 28 68-pounder carronades. To put this in perspective, a 68-pound cannonball is a sphere of iron the size of a man's head. When fired, it does not pierce the wood of an enemy ship. It smashes it. It hits with the force of a wrecking ball. The shock wave alone can kill. But the carronade had a fatal flaw, one that critics were quick to point out to Trollope. Its range was pitifully short. To bring these monsters to bear, Trollope would have to endure the enemy's fire for hundreds of yards without being able to reply. He would have to take a beating. He would have to let his ship be raked, his men be killed, and his spars be shot away, all while holding his fire. It required a specific kind of nerve to adopt this doctrine. It required a captain who possessed an almost suicidal level of patience. Trollope was that man. He drilled his crew relentlessly on the loading of these guns. The carronade, being lighter and mounted on a slide rather than a carriage, could be worked by fewer men and fired much faster than a long gun. Trollope turned his gun decks into a machine. He wasn't training them to snipe, he was training them to brawl. He taught them that their safety lay not in keeping the enemy at a distance, but in getting so close that they could not miss. He instilled in them a ferocious discipline, a belief that if they could just get alongside, nothing in the French Navy could stand against them. As July of 1796 approached, the Glatten was ready. She was an ugly duckling in a fleet of swans. Other captains mocked her. They called her a tub. They joked that she would be captured by the first French privateer she met because she couldn't outrun a rowboat. Trollope ignored them. He walked his quarterdeck, feeling the heavy roll of the ship, knowing that beneath his feet sat a battery of firepower that rivaled a first-rate ship of the line. He knew he was carrying a secret, but he also knew that secrets are dangerous things. If he miscalculated, if he engaged a French squadron that kept its distance and picked him apart with long guns, he would be responsible for the massacre of his entire crew. The line between genius and folly is often drawn in blood, and Trollope was walking it with his eyes wide open when he received his orders to cruise off the coast of Flanders. He must have felt a dark thrill of anticipation. He was taking his experiment into the laboratory of war. He wrote his final letters home, perhaps with a heavy hand, knowing the risks. He wasn't seeking glory in the traditional sense. He was seeking validation. He wanted to prove that a man with iron nerve and a ship with a heavy punch could defy the established laws of naval tactics. As the Glatten weighed anchor, leaving the safety of the English coast behind, she left as a curiosity. The dockyard workers watched her go, shaking their heads at the folly of the Admiralty. Poor old Trollope, they might have said, a good man wasted on a bad ship. Little did they know, as the grey horizon swallowed the Glatten sails, that old hard horse was sailing towards a destiny that would rewrite the textbooks. He was sailing to prove that in the poker game of war, a bad hand played with absolute conviction can defeat a royal flush. The forgotten man was about to become a legend, but first, he would have to survive the fire. To fully appreciate the violence that was about to unfold off the coast of Flanders, one must strip away the romance of the age of sail and examine the cold, hard mechanics of destruction. Naval warfare in the 18th century was a game of deception, But the deception practiced by the Admiralty with HMS Glatten was of a particularly cruel and industrial nature. To the casual observer watching from the harbour wall, she was an innocuous vessel. Her lines were thick, her movement through the water ponderous. She bore the unmistakable silhouette of the Honourable East India Company, a merchantman built to carry tea, spices and porcelain from the Orient to the London docks. But beneath that swollen mercantile exterior beat the heart of a monster. The Glatten was the result of a desperate shortage of frigates. The Admiralty, scouring the yards for anything that could float and fight, had purchased a number of these East Indiamen to convert into warships. The logic was sound, if unglamorous. These ships were built of the finest teak and oak, constructed to survive typhoons in the Indian Ocean. Their scantlings, the thickness of their hull timbers, were massive, often thicker than those of a standard Royal Navy frigate. They were, in essence, floating castles, but they were slow. In a chase, they were useless. In a retreat, they were hopeless. Captain Trollope, however, looked at the Glatten and saw not a liability, but a laboratory for a radical theory. If the ship could not catch the enemy, and could not run from the enemy, then she must be armed in such a way that any enemy foolish enough to come close would be instantly regretted. Enter the smasher. The standard naval doctrine of 1796 relied on the long gun. An 18-pounder or a 32-pounder cannon was a precision instrument. It was a long tube of cast iron that fired a ball at high velocity. It could punch a clean hole through a ship's side at a mile's distance. It was the weapon of the duelist, accurate, rangy, and respectful of the geometry of war. Trollope stripped the Glatten of these civilized weapons. In their place, he installed a battery of 28 68-pounder carronades on the lower deck and 28 42-pounder carronades on the upper deck. To the modern ear, these numbers are abstract, so let us contextualize the sheer horror of this armament. The carronade, invented by the Scotsman Robert Melville and cast at the Carron Ironworks, was the sawed-off shotgun of the naval world. It was short, squat, and incredibly light for its caliber. Because it was short, the propellant gas expanded rapidly, pushing the ball out at a much lower velocity than a long gun. This lower velocity was not a weakness, it was the entire point. When a high-velocity ball from a long gun strikes a ship, it tends to punch a neat, round hole. It passes through the timber, perhaps kills a man or two in its path, and exits the other side. It is clean. But when a 68-pound ball from a carronade, a sphere of iron the size of a large melon, strikes the side of a ship at low velocity, it does not pierce. It smashes. It transfers all its kinetic energy into the wood. It shatters the oak ribs of the target, sending a cloud of razor-sharp splinters, some the size of needles, others the size of spears, tearing through the crowded gun deck of the enemy. In the wooden world of naval combat, it is not the cannonball that kills the most men. It is the splinters. And the Glatten was designed to be a factory of splinters. The weight of metal the Glatten could throw in a single broadside was terrifying. A standard British 36-gun frigate could deliver a broadside weight of roughly 300 pounds of iron. A 74-gun ship of the line, the backbone of the battle fleet, threw around 800 pounds. The Glatten, this converted merchant tub, could throw a broadside of over 1,500 pounds. She possessed more destructive power at close range than HMS Victory. She was, quite literally, a first-rate ship of the line compressed into the hull of a grocer. But there was a catch, a devil's bargain that kept Trollope awake at night. The carronade had a pitifully short range. To be effective, the smashers needed to be within 300 to 400 yards. To be decisive, they needed to be within 50. Beyond that, the heavy balls would simply drop harmlessly into the sea. This created a supreme tactical dilemma. To use his secret weapon, Trollope would have to endure the death zone. He would have to sail his slow, plodding ship through a mile of enemy fire, taking hit after hit from their long guns, unable to reply. He would have to watch his sails be shredded and his men cut down, holding his nerve until he was close enough to see the whites of the enemy's eyes. If his masts were shot away before he closed the distance, he would be a sitting duck, pounded into submission from afar by an enemy he could not touch. It required a crew of exceptional discipline to accept this suicide pact. And this is where Trollope's genius as a leader shone. He didn't just drill them in gunnery, he drilled them in psychology. He made them understand that their safety lay in patience. "Don't fire until I give the word," he would have told them, walking the gun decks where the massive, ugly snouts of the carronades sat on their slide carriages. "If you fire early, we are dead. If you wait, they are dead." The men of the Glatten took to calling their ship the Slaughterhouse, not out of fear, but out of a grim, gallows-humor expectation of what they would do to the French. They knew they were sailing in a trap. The high bulwarks of the East Indiaman design, originally meant to protect cargo from waves, would now serve to protect the crew from musketry. The thick hull would absorb the French shot. They were a floating fortress, a tortoise with the bite of a dragon. The preparation was meticulous. The carronades were fitted with screw-quote elevation mechanisms for faster aiming. The slide carriages allowed them to be reloaded with fewer men, meaning that even if casualties were high, the guns could still speak. Trollope had thought of everything, calculating the angles of death with the cold precision of an actuary. As the fitting out concluded and the Glatten prepared to slip her moorings at the Nore, a strange atmosphere settled over the ship. She was a hybrid, a mutant of naval architecture that defied classification. To the Admiralty, she was an experiment. To the French spies who surely watched her departure, she was a confusing anomaly too big to be a frigate, too small to be a liner, too heavily armed to be a merchant. Little did they know that the French Navy's obsession with classification would be their undoing. They would look at the Glatten and see a target. They would see a slow, fat vessel ripe for capture. They would not see the 68-pounders lurking behind the closed ports. They would not see the smasher waiting to turn their confident frigates into driftwood. When the Glatten finally turned her prow toward the grey, choppy expanse of the North Sea in July 1796, she was not just a ship on patrol. She was a loaded gun, cocked and pointed at the heart of the Republic. The wind filled her canvas, pushing her heavy frame through the swell, and Captain Trollope must have felt the vibration of the deck, the hum of potential energy waiting to be released. He had his ship. He had his crew. He had his secret. He had his secret. Now, all he needed was a victim. The wolf had donned its sheepskin. The trap was set. And somewhere over the horizon, amidst the shoals and fog of Flanders, a squadron of French frigates was sailing blissfully towards a rendezvous with a weapon they could not imagine and a violence they could not survive. The experiment was over. The slaughter was about to begin. The afternoon of July 15, 1796, began to die over the North Sea, the light stretching long and gold across the grey swells. On the quarter-deck of the Glatten, the air grew heavy, charged with that peculiar metallic taste that predates a thunderstorm. But the storm gathering on the horizon was not born of clouds. It was born of canvas and timber. The lookout's cry when it came was not a surprise, but a confirmation of the inevitable. "Sail ho! Dead ahead!" Captain Trollope did not rush. He walked to the rail, his movement deliberate. A study in practiced calm designed to steady the nerves of the teenagers and pressed men watching him from the waist of the ship. He raised his glass. There, cutting through the haze, was the nightmare. It was Commodore Clermont's squadron. The Bruges, a heavy 50-gun frigate, led the line, her hull painted in the fierce, chaotic colours of the Republic. Flanking her were the Incorruptible and the Magician, both heavy frigates, followed by the Républicain and two smaller corvettes, likely the Unity and the Peru. The mathematics of the engagement were immediately apparent to every officer on the British deck. The French possessed 6 ships to the Glatton's one. They had the weather gauge. They had the speed. They had the numbers. By all rights, the Glatten was already a prize. The only administrative detail remaining was the signing of the surrender papers. The French squadron altered course. They had spotted the solitary British vessel. On the deck of the Bruges, one can imagine the mood. It would have been one of predatory delight. Through their telescopes, they saw the bluff bows and the thick waist of an East Indiaman. To the French, this was not a warship. It was a floating bank vault. It was a floating bank vault. It was tea, silk, and spices wrapped in a slow, clumsy package. They likely signalled one another with the naval equivalent of a laugh, a general chase, a race to see who could claim the prize money. They did not even bother to form a strict line of battle. Why would you need a line of battle to catch a grocer? This arrogance was the first tumblers of the lock clicking into place. On the Glatten, the silence was absolute. Trollope had ordered the decks cleared for action, but he had given a specific, terrifying instruction: silence. No cheering, no shouting, no drum beating. He wanted the Glatten to appear asleep, or perhaps paralyzed by fear. He wanted to look like a merchant captain who had panicked and lost his wits. "Starboard your helm," Trollope said, his voice low. "Bring her up." The sailing master spun the wheel. The Glatton's bow swung. She did not turn away from the enemy. She did not turn to run back to the safety of Yarmouth. She turned directly towards the Brutus. A ripple of confusion must have passed through the British crew. To sail towards 6 French frigates was contrary to every survival instinct a sailor possesses. It was the behaviour of a madman. But as they looked at Trollope, standing rock still by the binnacle, they saw no madness. They saw calculation. They remembered the drills. They remembered the drills. They remembered the smasher. And a grim understanding began to settle over the gun deck. The captain was closing the range. He was taking them into the slaughterhouse, yes, but he was bringing the butcher's knife with him. The distance closed with agonizing slowness. 3 miles. 2 miles. The only sounds were the slap of the water against the hull and the wind in the rigging. The tension on the deck was a physical weight, pressing down on the lungs. Men stood by their guns, the slow matches burning, the smoke curling up in thin blue ribbons. They stripped off their shirts, their skin pale in the fading light. They scattered sand on the planks. They waited. 1 mile. The French were now close enough that the British could hear the shouts of their officers. The Brutus was a magnificent sight, a towering wall of wood, her gun ports open, the bronze muzzles of her cannons gleaming. She was fast, cutting the water with a sharp, arrogant prow. She was manoeuvring to cut off the Glatton's escape, unaware that escape was the last thing on Trollope's mind. The French commodore, puzzled by the British ship's behaviour, likely assumed the merchant captain was coming alongside to strike his colours without a fight. It was the sensible thing to do. Why die for a cargo of tea? At 1/2 mile, the Brutus fired a gun to leeward, a signal to heave to. Trollope ignored it. He held his course, steady as a rock. He was aiming for the pistol shot, that deadly, intimate distance of fewer than 50 yards. He needed to be so close that he could not miss. He needed to be so close that the French could not depress their guns low enough to hit his hull, while his carronades could sweep their decks clean. The French, growing impatient, fired a shot across the Glatton's bow. The ball whistled through the rigging, severing a rope that fell to the deck with a soft slap. Still, Trollope did not answer. He stared at the Brutus, watching the gap narrow. 400 yards. 300 yards. The discipline required in these final minutes cannot be overstated. To stand on a wooden deck, watching a 50-gun frigate prepare to blow you out of the water and to do nothing, requires a courage that borders on the supernatural. The gun crews on the Glatten were vibrating with the urge to fire, to release the tension, to do something, but the officers walked the lines, whispering, "Steady, steady, lads, wait for the word." 200 yards. The Brutus was now looming over them, a mountain of sail. The French crew crowded the rails, muskets in hand, ready to board. They were shouting insults, jeering at the roast beefs, calling for them to surrender. They could see the British officers on the quarterdeck. They could see the lack of uniforms on the common sailors. They were convinced this was a merchant ship. Then, at 20 yards a distance so close, a man could throw a biscuit from one ship to the other. Captain Trollope finally moved. He stepped to the rail. He did not use a speaking trumpet. He simply nodded to the quartermaster at the halyards. Up colours. The bundle of fabric at the mizzen peak was broken out. The red ensign of the Royal Navy caught the wind, snapping open in a flash of crimson defiance. At the same moment, the pendant of a king's ship was hoisted to the main top. The reaction on the French decks would have been one of pure, unadulterated shock. The sheep had just revealed its teeth. The merchantman was a man of war. "Now," Trollope said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Fire." It was not a ripple of fire. It was an eruption. The entire port side of the Glatten dissolved into flame and smoke. The 28 carronades, loaded with heavy round shot and grape shot, detonated as one. The sound was not the sharp crack of long guns. It was a dull, earth-shattering thump that was felt in the chest as much as heard in the ears. The Glatten heeled over from the recoil of her own broadside. Across the 20 yards of water, the Brutus ceased to be a ship and became a tragedy. The storm of iron from the smashers did not just hit the French frigate, it disemboweled her. The heavy balls smashed through the scantlings, shattering the timber into deadly clouds of splinters that swept the crowded French decks like a scythe. The grape-shot canvas-bags filled with musket balls shredded the sails and turned the waiting boarding parties into a red mist. In 1 second, the arrogance of the French squadron vanished. In 1 second, the silence of the afternoon was replaced by the screams of the wounded and the roar of a battle that would defy belief. The fox had not just turned on the hounds, the fox had just turned on the throat out of the leader, that as the smoke billowed up, thick and choking, enveloping both ships in a sulphurous fog, Trollope knew that this was only the opening note. He had struck the first blow, yes, but he was still surrounded. The other 5 ships were turning. The Brutus, though wounded, was not sunk. The trap was sprung, but the Glatten was still inside it. The easy part was over. Now the long night began. The sound of a broadside from a ship of the line is often described as a roar, a continuous rolling thunder that echoes across the water, but the sound that erupted from the HMS Glatten that evening was something altogether different. It was a singular, concussive event, a sledgehammer blow that seemed to suck the very air out of the channel. When 56 heavy carronades speak in unison, they do not merely make a noise, they create a physical overpressure, a shockwave that rattles the teeth and stops the heart. As the smoke from that initial, devastating volley rolled back over the Glatton's deck, thick and greasy with the smell of burnt powder, the crew did not cheer. There was no time for exultation. In the hellish twilight of the gun deck, lit only by the glowing linstocks and the muzzle flashes, the men were already moving. This was the moment for which Trollope had drilled them until their hands bled. The carronade, for all its ugliness, possessed a virtue that was about to save their lives: speed. Mounted on slides rather than the clumsy wheeled carriages of long guns, the smasher could be run in, sponged, loaded, and run out again with terrifying rapidity, while the French on the Brutus were still reeling, their ears ringing, their decks a slaughterhouse of splintered timber and broken men. The British gunners were already ramming home the next charge. Heave! Run out! The commands were barked by the gun captains, cutting through the ringing deafness. The heavy iron slides groaned as the guns were pushed back into the ports. The British crew worked with the frantic, jerky rhythm of automatons. They knew that their survival depended on the rate of fire. They had to create a wall of iron that the French could not penetrate. On the other side of the smoke, the Brutus was in agony. The damage inflicted by that first broadside is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. The standard 18-pound cannonball might punch a hole the size of a dinner plate. The 68-pound balls from the Glatten were the size of pumpkins. They had not pierced the French hull. They had smashed it in. Entire sections of the Brutus's bulwarks had simply ceased to exist, turned into clouds of razor-sharp oak splinters that swept the waist of the ship like a lethal hail. The psychological impact on the French command was catastrophic. Commodore Clement, standing amidst the wreckage of his quarterdeck, must have been paralyzed by a sudden, terrifying confusion. He had expected a merchantman. He had expected a merchantman. He had engaged a merchantman. Yet the volume of fire pouring into his ship suggested he was fighting a first-rate ship of the line, a 74-gun behemoth that had somehow disguised itself as a trader. It was a belief that would persist long after the battle. In their official reports, the French would swear they had been attacked by a squadron or a massive battleship. They could not conceive that a single converted East Indiaman could unleash such hell. But the Brutus was not alone, and the shock of the ambush could only last so long. As the Glatten poured a second and then a third broadside into the flagship, the rest of the French wolf pack began to close in. The Magicienne and the Incorruptible, heavy frigates with crews of over 300 men each, surged forward, their captains eager to avenge the mauling of their commodore. They split, one manoeuvring to pass across the Glatton's stern to rake her, the other coming up hard on her leeward quarter. This was the moment the battle shifted from an ambush to a desperate 360-degree brawl. Captain Trollope, pacing the quarterdeck amidst the whistle of musket balls, saw the danger. If the French frigates could cross his stern, the raking position, they could fire down the length of his ship, killing his men in droves and destroying his guns from behind. "Hard a port!" he bellowed. "Fire to leeward!" The Glatten was now fighting on both sides. This is the nightmare scenario for any naval commander. The crew had to be split. Men rushed from the starboard guns to man the port battery, scrambling over the sanding on the decks, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes wide and white in the gloom. The noise became a continuous, deafening cacophony. The Glatten was no longer a ship, she was a volcano. To starboard, she hammered the Brutus and the Unity. To port, she engaged the Magicienne and the Incorruptible. The air was filled with the scream of passing shot, the tearing of canvas, and the sickening thud of iron striking wood. The range was suicidal, mere yards separated the ships. At one point, the Glatten was so close to the Magician that the British sailors could hear the French officers shouting orders to board. But Trollope had anticipated this too. The smashers were not just loaded with round shot. They were double-shotted with canister tin cases filled with musket balls. As the French boarding parties gathered on their rails, preparing to leap across the gap, the Glatton's guns roared. The effect was that of a giant shotgun blast. The French rails were swept clean. The boarding attempt dissolved in a spray of blood and wood chips. Yet for all the offensive power of the Glatten, she was taking a terrible beating. She was a stationary target, an anvil surrounded by hammers. The French, realizing they could not win a gunnery duel at close range, elevated their sights. They began to aim for the rigging. This was the Achilles heel of Trollope's plan. His hull was thick, his guns were deadly, but his masts were just as vulnerable as any other ships. The French strategy was clear: strip the Glatten of her motive power. If they could knock down her masts, she would be dead in the water. Then they could stand off at long range, outside the reach of the deadly carronades, and pound her into submission at their leisure. High above the deck, the rigging of the Glatten was being shredded. Ropes snapped with the sound of pistol shots whipping wildly in the air. The sails, riddled with holes, hung in tatters. Blocks and spars rained down on the gun crews, adding a vertical peril to the horizontal fire. Trollope, watching his topmast shudder under the impact of the French shot, knew that the clock was ticking. He was winning the fight on the gun deck, but he was losing the battle in the air. Down below, the scene was dantesque. The gun deck was filled with smoke so thick that men could only see the person next to them. The heat was suffocating. The carronades, firing again and again, grew hot to the touch. The recoil of the guns strained the breech ropes, the heavy slides jumping like living things. Boys, the powder monkeys, ran back and forth from the magazine, clutching cartridges to their chests, dodging the recoil of the guns, their small forms weaving through the chaos of the giants. There was no panic. This is the most remarkable detail of the engagement. In the midst of this inferno, surrounded by 6 enemy ships, the discipline of the Glatton's crew held. There were no screams of mutiny, no breaking of the line. There was only the rhythmic, industrial process of loading and firing. They trusted the old hard horse on the quarterdeck. They trusted the smashers. Suddenly, a new threat emerged. The Républicaine, the fourth frigate, saw an opening. The Glatten, preoccupied with the Brutus and the Magicienne, had left her stern exposed. The French captain seized the moment, bringing his ship around to deliver the coup de grace. Trollope saw the manoeuvre. He knew that if the Républicaine poured a broadside into his stern windows, it would massacre the officers in the wardroom and likely detonate the ammunition-ready use lockers. He had seconds to react. But the Glatten, with her shredded sails, was sluggish. She would not turn in time. The men on the quarterdeck braced themselves. They watched the French frigate's bowsprit loom out of the smoke, crossing their wake. They saw the gun ports open. They saw the fuses glowing. It seemed that the gamble had finally failed. The weight of numbers was simply too great. The Glatten had fought like a lion, but now the hunters were closing in for the kill. The French captain raised his sword, ready to give the order that would turn the Glatten into a drifting tomb. But just as the order trembled on his lips, a strange sound cut through the din, a deep, groaning crack that came not from a cannon, but from the French ship itself. Little did they know, the Glatton's previous broadside had done more than just sweep the decks. A stray 68-pound ball, fired blindly through the smoke, had found a critical weakness in the French structure, and the consequences were about to change the course of the night. The naval battlefield is a chaotic theatre. But in the heart of the action of July 15th, there was a moment where the chaos crystallized into a tableau of pure, unadulterated peril. The Glatten was no longer fighting a battle. She was enduring an execution. We left Captain Trollope staring down the barrels of the Républicaine. The French frigate poised to rake his stern, a manoeuvre that, by all rights, should have ended the contest. The French captain had the angle. He had the timing. But he did not have the structure. Moments before the order to fire could be given, a 68-pound ball from the Glatton's previous blind volley had struck the French ship's bowsprit. It was a lucky shot, perhaps, or a testament to the sheer volume of metal Trollope was throwing into the void. The impact shattered the heavy spar, sending the jib and headsails collapsing into the water. The drag was instantaneous. The Républicaine lurched, her bow wrenched violently off course. Instead of crossing the Glatton's stern to deliver the death blow, she swung harmlessly away, her broadside firing wildly into the empty ocean. A collective breath must have been released on the British quarterdeck, but there was no time for relief. The Glatten was saved from immediate destruction only to find herself in a slowly tightening noose. The sun had now fully set. The only illumination came from the muzzle flashes, strobing like lightning in a thunderhead, revealing brief, horrific glimpses of the carnage. The Glatten was surrounded. To her port, the Brutus and the Magicienne pounded her hull. To her starboard, the Incorruptible and the smaller corvettes poured in a relentless hail of shot. This was the circle of fire. Trollope was now fighting a battle of attrition that he mathematically could not win. His ship was being dismantled around him. The French, realizing that the Glatton's hull was thick enough to repel their balls at this range, had elevated their guns. They were stripping the bird of its feathers. The standing rigging, the complex web of shrouds and stays that held the masts upright, was being severed, strand by strand. The mainmast and foremast were wounded, groaning under the strain of the sails. If the masts fell, the Glatten would be finished. She would roll helplessly in the swell, unable to aim her guns, while the French stood off and picked her apart. It is here, in this crucible of noise and darkness, that we see the true measure of Henry Trollope. He did not seek the shelter of the barricades. He walked the deck, a solitary figure amidst the storm. The air around him was alive with lead. Musket balls from the French marines in the fighting tops buzzed like angry hornets. Splinters the size of javelins cartwheeled across the planking. At the height of the action, Trollope raised his speaking trumpet to shout an order to the forward batteries. As he brought the instrument to his lips, a musket ball struck it, shattering the brass in his hand. He didn't flinch. He didn't check for wounds. He simply threw the broken handle to the deck, cupped his hands around his mouth, and bellowed the order with his own lungs. It was a moment of supreme, almost theatrical defiance that steeled the resolve of every man who saw it. If the old man isn't scared, they must have thought, then neither are we. But courage alone cannot stop cannonballs. The Glatten was taking water. The pumps were manned. The cockpit, deep in the bowels of the ship where the surgeon worked by lantern light, was filling with the groans of the wounded. The all-is-lost moment was approaching. The sheer weight of fire from 5 ships was overwhelming the rate of fire of 1. Yet it was precisely at this moment of maximum pressure that the genius of the carronade and the discipline of the British seamen delivered its validation. The French were firing fast, but they were firing high. The British were firing straight. The short, ugly guns of the Glatten were doing exactly what they were designed to do. They were eating the enemy alive. The Glatton's gun crews, exhausted, deafened, and covered in grime, had fallen into a trance of destruction. They were no longer aiming at individual ships. They were firing into the wall of wood that surrounded them. And because the carronades were so heavy, every hit was catastrophic. On the Magine, the damage was appalling. A single broadside from the Glatten had smashed her lower deck ports into a single gaping maw. Her crew, terrified by the sheer percussive force of the British guns, began to falter. They had never experienced incoming fire like this. It wasn't just knocking down walls. It was shaking the rivets out of their courage. Then came the turning point. The Glatton's pilot, a man named Williams, spotted the Brutus looming dangerously close on the lee bow. The French flagship, despite her earlier mauling, was trying to close the distance to board. She was huge, towering over the Glatten. Trollope saw the threat. He ordered the forward carronades to be double-shotted. "Wait," he told the gun captains. "Wait until she fills the port." When the Brutus was mere feet away, the Glatten fired. The result was less a gunshot and more a demolition. The heavy shot smashed into the Brutus's prow. It severed the bobstays. It shattered the gammoning. The French flagship's bowsprit, deprived of its support, snapped upwards and crashed down, dragging the foretopmast with it. A cheer went up from the British deck, a raw, guttural sound of triumph. The Brutus, the leader of the pack, was crippled. She fell off the wind, her deck a tangle of wreckage and confusion. Seeing their commodore mauled for the second time, the confidence of the French squadron shattered. They were 6 ships against 1. They should have won an hour ago. But this monster in their midst simply refused to die. Every time they closed in, they were met with a blast of iron that dismasted them or decimated their crews. They were fighting a ghost ship, a vessel that absorbed punishment like a sponge and returned it like a hammer. One by one, the French captains made the same calculation. The prize was not worth the price. The Magicienne, bleeding from a dozen wounds, bore away. The Incorruptible, her rigging shredded, turned downwind. The corvettes, realizing they were out of their depth, scattered into the darkness. The circle of fire began to break. On the Glatten, the cessation of incoming fire must have felt more shocking than the noise itself. The sudden silence was deafening. The smoke began to drift away, revealing the moonlit water. The sea around them was empty, save for the receding shapes of the French squadron, limping back towards the coast of Holland like whipped dogs. Trollope stood by the taffrail, his face black with powder, his uniform torn. He looked at his ship. The Glatten was a wreck. Her sails hung in ribbons. Her hull was scarred and pitted, but the ensign the Red Duster was still flying. He had done the impossible. He had taken a merchant ship into a fleet action and won. He had proven the carronade. He had vindicated the Admiralty's experiment. But Henry Trollope was not a man to rest on his laurels. As he watched the French retreat, a dangerous light entered his eyes. He did not want to survive. He wanted to finish it. He turned to his exhausted sailing master. "Where's ship?" he rasped, his voice a ruin. "We're going after them." The master looked at him as if he were insane. "Pursue? In this condition? With half the standing rigging shot away?" "Sir," the master said, gesturing to the swaying masts, "if we turn the ship into the wind, the sticks will come down. We will lose the mainmast." Trollope looked up, He saw the truth of it. The mainmast was held up by a prayer and a few strands of hemp. If they put any strain on it, it would snap, and the Glatten would be left drifting and helpless. If the French saw that, they might turn back. It was the hardest decision of the night, to let the prey escape when the hunter's blood was up. Trollope clenched his jaw, the adrenaline fading to leave a crushing fatigue. "Very well," he said, the words heavy with regret. "Keep her steady. Let them go." The Battle of the Glatten was over. The shooting had stopped, but as the adrenaline crashed and the reality of their survival set in, the crew faced a new terror. They were alone, miles from home, in a sinking ship, with the long, cold night stretching out before them. The enemy had gone, but the sea remained, and it is a foe that takes no prisoners. Little did they know, as they began the grim work of patching the hull and tending to the dying, that their ordeal was not quite finished. The dawn would bring not just the sun, but a revelation that would stun the entire Royal Navy. The silence that descends upon a ship after a close-quarters engagement is not a peaceful silence. It is a heavy, ringing void that presses against the ears, louder in its own way than the roar of the guns. For hours, the world of the Glatten had been a cacophony of thunder, screaming metal, and shouting men. Now, as the last French frigate faded into the gloom, the noise vanished, replaced by the sounds of the aftermath, the rhythmic, desperate clanking of the pumps, the groaning of wounded timber, and the low, murmuring prayers of the surgeon's mates in the cockpit. It was in this long, sepulchral night that the true magnitude of the victory began to settle upon the shoulders of Captain Trollope. The adrenaline, that potent spirit that allows men to perform superhuman feats of loading and firing, was draining away, leaving behind a cold, shaking exhaustion. The men on the gun deck, their faces masked in soot and sweat so that they resembled devils more than sailors, collapsed where they stood. They leaned against the hot barrels of the carronades, their chests heaving, too tired to cheer, too tired even to speak. They had looked into the abyss, and by some miracle of discipline and iron, the abyss had blinked first. But the danger was far from over. The Glatten was a ruin. The battle had been won not by manoeuvring, but by standing still and taking punishment. The cost of that strategy was now visible in the moonlight. The hull was scarred and pitted, though the massive timbers of the East Indiaman construction had saved them from being hauled below the waterline. The rigging, however, was a disaster. The standing rigging, the shrouds that held the masts in place, hung in tatters. The sails were little more than rags fluttering in the breeze. Every time the ship rolled in the swell, the masts groaned ominously, threatening to come crashing down and crush the exhausted crew beneath a tangle of heavy spars. Trollope remained on the quarterdeck, a solitary figure keeping a vigil over his broken command. His uniform was torn, his hands blackened, but his mind was still racing. His decision to break off the pursuit haunted him. It is the curse of the warrior to always wonder if more could have been done. He watched the distant lights of the French squadron, now mere pinpricks on the horizon, heading for the safety of Flushing. He knew that if he had chased them, if he had pushed his luck just 1 inch further, his masts would have gone over the side, and the Glatten would have been left a drifting hulk, easy prey for the morning light. It was a victory of nerves as much as gunnery. The French had not been defeated by superior numbers. They had been defeated by a psychological monster. They had engaged a ship that refused to behave according to the rules of war. They had pounded her, surrounded her, and raked her. Yet she had continued to spit fire with a ferocity that suggested she was invulnerable. The French commodore, nursing his battered flagship, must have been utterly bewildered. In his mind, he had not fought a frigate. He had fought a fortress. The fear that the Glatten might be the vanguard of a larger British fleet must have played on his mind, driving his decision to retreat. Trollope's audacity had created an illusion of strength that broke the enemy's will. Throughout the night, the crew of the Glatten worked with a grim determination. There was no sleep. The carpenter and his mates were over the side on stages, plugging shot holes. The boatswain was aloft, splicing ropes in the dark, trying to secure the masts before the wind rose. It was a display of seamanship as heroic as the battle itself. To fight is one thing. To save a sinking ship in the pitch black, with the enemy potentially lurking just out of sight, requires a different kind of courage. A quiet, professional stoicism that is the hallmark of the Royal Navy. Trollope moved among them, offering a word here, a nod there. The barrier of rank, usually so rigid in the Georgian Navy, softened in the darkness. They were survivors of the same storm. He checked the guns, ensuring they were reloaded. He knew the French might realize their mistake and return. If they did, the Glatten would have to fight again, this time without the element of surprise. The tension of that vigil was excruciating. Every shadow on the water looked like a returning frigate. Every creak of a spar sounded like the onset of disaster. But the night passed. The pumps kept the water at bay. The masts held. And then the grey light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky. As the sun rose, lifting the curtain of darkness, the men crowded the rails, shielding their eyes against the glare. They scanned the horizon. To the south, the sea was empty. The French were gone. The relief that swept through the ship was physical. It was not a cheer. It was a collective exhale. They had done it. They had fought a squadron of 6 ships inflicting terrible damage, and they were still afloat. The old hard horse had been right. The hauled hard horse had been right. The smasher had worked. In the cold light of morning, the Glatten looked appalling. Her sides were stuck full of shot. Her decks were ploughed up. But high above the wreckage, the red ensign still flew. It was tattered, smoke-stained, and pierced by musket balls. But it was there. Trollope ordered the course set for Yarmouth. The journey home would be slow, a limp rather than a sail. But as the Glatten turned her bluff bow towards England, a new realization began to dawn on the captain. He had just participated in one of the most singular actions in naval history. He had taken a ship that everyone mocked, a slow, ugly, converted merchantman, and used it to humiliate the pride of the French Republic. He did not know it yet, but he was sailing back to a nation that was desperate for heroes. He was sailing back to a controversy that would rage in the Admiralty for years. And he was sailing back to prove, once and for all, that in the hands of a British crew, even a tub could be a terror. The battle was over. The long night was finished. But the story of the Glatten was about to enter a new arena, the court of public opinion, where the legend would be cemented. As the white cliffs of England eventually rose from the sea, Trollope went to his cabin to write his dispatch. He dipped his quill in ink, his hand likely shaking with fatigue, and began to compose the understated words that would become famous. "I have the honour to acquaint you." Little did he know, his report would be read not just by the lords of the Admiralty, but by a king, and eventually by a nation that would never look at a merchant ship the same way again. When HMS Glatten finally limped into Yarmouth roads, she did not look like a victor. She looked like a survivor of a shipwreck that had somehow refused to sink. Her sails were a patchwork of canvas and despair, riddled with so many holes they resembled fishing nets more than propulsion. Her standing rigging hung in loose melancholy loops, spliced and knotted by exhausted boatswains during the crossing. Her hull, once the pride of the East India Company, was scarred, pitted and scorched, resembling the face of a prize fighter who has gone 12 rounds with a bare-knuckled champion. To the dockyard workers and the citizens of Yarmouth who gathered on the harbour walls, the sight of Captain Trollope's command must have elicited a gasp of horror. Rumours fly faster than ships, and the coast had been rife with speculation. Had the experiment failed? Had the old hard horse driven his ungainly tub into a massacre? As the anchor splashed into the grey water, bringing the battered vessel to rest, the silence on the shore was profound. They waited for the boats to lower the wounded. They waited for the grim tally of the dead, but as the official returns were made, a shockwave of a different kind rippled through the fleet. In an engagement that had lasted for hours against a squadron of 6 French warships, with the air thick with flying iron and splintered oak, the Glatton's casualty list was medically inexplicable. Captain Trollope reported no men killed, not one. and only 2 men wounded Captain Strangeways of the Marines, who had taken a musket ball to the thigh, and a corporal. It seemed impossible. It defied the laws of probability. A ship surrounded, raked and pounded by frigates should have been a charnel house. The cockpit should have been overflowing. But here, the secret of the Glatton's construction offered its final, silent vindication. The Admiralty's decision to convert an East Indiaman, mocked by so many as a foolish economy, had saved the crew. The Glatton's timbers were massive, built to withstand the crushing pressures of the Indian Ocean. The French shot, fired from a distance, had simply embedded itself in the thick teak hull, like plums in a pudding. The ship had absorbed the punishment that would have shattered a standard frigate, protecting the soft flesh of the men inside. Trollope sat in his cabin to write his dispatch to the Admiralty. It is a document that stands as a masterpiece of British naval understatement. There is no poetry in it, no breathless recounting of his own heroism. He does not boast of taking on a fleet single-handed. He writes with the dry, professional detachment of a man filing a tax return. "I have the honour to acquaint you," he begins, "that on the 15th instant we discovered a squadron of ships." He details the manoeuvres, the bearings and the gunnery with a forensic precision. He praises his men, naturally, commending their steady and determined coolness. But he treats the event as a day's work. He apologizes for not bringing a prize home, noting with a hint of frustration that his rigging was too cut up to pursue the enemy. He describes driving off 6 warships as if he had merely dispersed a crowd of unruly hooligans. However, if Trollope's report was a study in modesty, the reaction from the French was a study in humiliation and fabrication. When Commodore Camont's squadron linked back to Flushing, they had a difficult story to tell. How does one explain to the revolutionary government, a regime that regarded failure as treason, that 6 warships had been beaten by 1 merchantman? To admit the truth would be to invite a court-martial, or worse, the guillotine. So, they lied. Or perhaps, in the heat and smoke of the battle, they had truly deceived themselves. The French reports claimed they had engaged a British squadron. Some accounts insisted the Glatten was a cut-down ship of the line, a 74-gun battleship masquerading as a smaller vessel. They spoke of the terrifying volume of fire, the infernal machines that spewed iron with a speed and violence they had never encountered. In their attempt to save face, the French inadvertently paid Trollope the highest compliment imaginable. They had to invent a superior force to explain their defeat by his inferior one. They elevated the Glatten from a tub to a leviathan because the alternative that they had been broken by the discipline of a single British crew and the genius of the carronade was too painful to bear. In London, the news hit with the force of a thunderclap. The gloom that had hung over the capital lifted. The Admiralty, previously anxious about the unorthodox experiment, was jubilant. Lord Spencer, the First Lord, realized that they had stumbled upon a tactical revelation. The carronade was no longer a theoretical curiosity, it was a proven ship-killer. The critics who had sneered at the smasher fell silent. The captains who had turned up their noses at the command of such an ugly ship suddenly found themselves petitioning for carronades to be fitted to their own quarterdecks. Trollope became the toast of the town. He was knighted by King George III, a reward for a man who had proved that the spirit of the Navy lay not in the sleekness of the hull, but in the heart of the fight. But perhaps the most poignant verdict came from the merchants of London, the men of the city whose trade routes the Glatten had been built to protect. In a gesture of gratitude, they presented Trollope with a piece of plate, a silver trophy acknowledging that he had saved not just their ships, but their confidence. As the Glatten lay at anchor, undergoing the repairs that would ready her for her next patrol, she was no longer an outcast. She was a celebrity. Sailors from other ships rowed over just to touch her scarred timber, to run their hands over the deep gouges left by French shot, and to look with wide eyes at the squat black muzzles of the guns that had fought a fleet. The court of public opinion had sat, and the verdict was unanimous. The experiment was a triumph. The forgotten man had become a hero, and the Royal Navy had learned a lesson that would serve it well in the bloody years to come. That a ship is only as good as the men who stand behind the guns, and that sometimes The most dangerous weapon at sea is a man who simply refuses to turn the wheel. To understand the true weight of what happened off the coast of Flanders on that grey July evening, we must look beyond the splintered timber and the smoke. The action of July 15th was not merely a skirmish. It was a pivot point in the history of naval warfare. It was the moment when the theory of violence caught up with the practice of it, and the Royal Navy discovered a terrible new truth about the nature of the sea. The immediate legacy of the Glatten was the apotheosis of the carronade. Before Henry Trollope's gamble, the smasher was viewed with suspicion by the naval establishment, a novelty weapon, useful perhaps for small privateers or merchant defence, but beneath the dignity of a king's ship. The Glatten silenced those critics forever. She proved that in the chaotic, claustrophobic reality of a naval battle, range was a luxury, but weight of metal was a necessity. In the years that followed, the carronades spread through the fleet like a contagion. Captains who had once sneered at the short, ugly guns now clamoured for them. Frigates were refitted, their quarterdecks and forecastles bristling with 32-pounder carronades. The logic was ruthless. If the British sailor could load faster and stand firmer than his French counterpart, then the goal of every captain should be to close the distance to pistol shot immediately. The Glatten doctrine became the standard doctrine. We can draw a direct line of gunpowder and blood from the deck of the Glatten in 1796 to the most famous deck in maritime history, HMS Victory at Trafalgar in 1805. When Nelson broke the French line, the very first lethal blow struck by his flagship was not from her long guns. It was from a massive 68-pounder carronade mounted on her forecastle, loaded with a keg of 500 musket balls. That single shot cleared the deck of the French flagship Bucentaure, killing or wounding scores of men in a split second. That gun, that moment of devastation, owes its lineage to Henry Trollope. The Glatten was the crucible in which the tactics of total annihilation were forged. But what of the ship herself? The Glatten did not fade immediately into obscurity. She remained a useful, if peculiar, asset to the Navy. In 1801, she found herself in the thick of the action again at the Battle of Copenhagen. And here, history offers us a delicious irony. Who was her captain on that day? None other than William Bligh, Breadfruit Bligh of the Bounty. It is a testament to the Glatton's character that she was commanded by two of the most notoriously difficult and stubborn men in the service. Under Bligh, she fought with distinction, anchoring close to the Danish batteries and pounding them into submission, proving once again that she was a ship built for the brawl, not the ballet. However, the end of the Glatten was not one of glory. Like many warriors who survived the war, she found no place in the peace. As the Napoleonic Wars ground to a halt, the need for converted merchantmen vanished. She was stripped of her guns, those beloved, hateful smashers, and converted into a water depot. For years she rotted quietly in the Medway, a ghost of her former self, until she was finally sunk as a breakwater in 1830. There is a profound melancholy in this image, the ship that fought 5 frigates and won, ending her days as a sunken barrier to protect the harbour mud. And what of the man? What of Sir Henry Trollope? His story serves as a poignant reminder that the qualities that make a man a hero in war often make him a tragedy in peace. Trollope was knighted, yes. He was celebrated. He eventually rose to the rank of admiral, but the fire that burned within him, that pugnacious bulldog spirit that allowed him to stare down 6 French warships, never truly cooled. He was a man out of time, a relic of the hard, brutal, old Navy. As he aged, he drifted into the shadows. He did not die a glorious death on the quarterdeck like Nelson. He lived. He lived to see the world change, to see the wooden walls give way to steam and iron. He retired to a quiet life in Bath. But the silence did not suit him. Stories from his later years paint a picture of a man wrestling with his own demons, his temper becoming increasingly erratic, his eccentricities hardening into madness. The end, when it came in 1839, was not at the hands of the French. It was at his own hand. At the age of 83, the hero of the Glatten, suffering from a morbid irritability and the decline of his faculties, took his own life with a pistol. It is a stark, heartbreaking conclusion. The man who had faced the thunder of 200 cannons without flinching could not, in the end, face the quiet devastation of age and irrelevance. He is a reminder that the cost of such courage is often paid in installments, long after the peace treaties are signed. So why do we remember them? Why more than 2 centuries later do we retell the story of the Glatten? It is not just because of the tactics. It is not just because of the carronades. It is because the action of July 15, 1796 represents the distilled essence of the British naval spirit in the age of sail. It is a story of impossible odds. It tells us that when the world is burning, when the enemy is at the gate, and when the mathematics of survival say surrender, there is still a choice. You can turn the wheel. You can steer for the Commodore. You can steer for the Commodore. You can clear for action. The Glatten was an ugly ship. She was slow. She was mocked. But on that one night, in the dark waters of the North Sea, she was the most beautiful thing afloat. She stood as a wooden wall between the people of this island and the tyranny of the continent. She reminds us that history is not determined by the size of the dog in the fight, but by the size of the fight in the dog. As we look back at the long, glorious and bloody tapestry of our maritime history, let us not just look at the towering 3-deckers and the dashing frigates. Let us spare a thought for the tub. Let us raise a glass to the smasher. And let us remember Henry Trollope, the forgotten man who taught the world that British oak and British iron are hardest when they are alone. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the forgotten archives of the Royal Navy. If this story stirred something in you, if you value the preservation of these tales of courage and sacrifice, I would be honoured if you would subscribe to the channel and join our community. We have many more forgotten battles to fight and many more heroes to resurrect. Until next time, keep your powder dry.